and Prose. Thank you for joining us and tuning into this virtual format where we continue to bring authors and new books to you. I have the pleasure of hosting our event this evening, and I am delighted to welcome our guests, Sylvia Liu, in conversation with Donna Barba Higuera. Before we get started, we just have a couple of important housekeeping notes for you. If you would like to have closed captioning for this event, please look at the bottom of your screen and click on live transcript and then select show subtitle. You can click the link that we'll drop in the chat to get your own copy of Hana Hsu and the Ghost Crab Nation. A purchase of the book comes with exclusive promotional items, including a signed book plate and a bookmark, a postcard, and these really amazing, awesome stickers. And those are while supplies last, so you want to jump on that as soon as you can. Anyone who purchases a copy of Sylvia's book will also be entered into a raffle to win one of 20 signed fine art prints, thank you, Sylvia, from artist Catherine Alt Noble. And that is a scene from the book. So we're super excited about these. Lastly, if you have any questions for our guests, you can click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and add one there. At the end of the presentation, our guests will have time to answer some of your questions, but you are welcome to add questions anytime during the conversation. And you can also upvote the questions you like and want most answered. Now onto the event that you're waiting for. Sylvia Liu is a children's book author and former environmental attorney. She writes middle grade novels and picture books, including Hana Hsu and the Ghost Crab Nation, Manatee's Best Friend, and A Morning with Grandpa. She co-founded KidLit 411, a resource website for children's writers and illustrators. Sylvia grew up in Caracas, Venezuela, and currently lives in Virginia Beach with her family. Donna Barba Higuera grew up in Central California, surrounded by agricultural and oil fields. Her middle grade and picture books are about kids who find themselves in odd and scary situations. Her books include Lupe Wong Won't Dance and this year's Newbery Medal Winner, The Last Cuentista. Donna lives in Washington State with her family, and it is now my pleasure to turn the event over to them.
Yay, we're here. I am so excited for this because I had the pleasure of reading your book. Bragging rights, I read it before other people here and thoroughly enjoyed it. So I am so glad to be here with you and celebrating. And we've known each other for a while and we've shared our previous books together as well. And so thank you for letting me be here with you. I really appreciate it because I am so excited about your book. And I'm going to do my best not to give any spoilers away because I'm excited. There's a lot of fun stuff in this book. So I'm going to try not to give those away. But first, I want to talk a little bit about your background.
Wait, can I just quickly interrupt and say how excited I am to be here talking with you? I'm so thrilled and honored because I just am absolutely in awe of both the books that you've written. Lupe Wong was just so funny and endearing and just laugh out loud. It has the best first line ever. And then The Last Cuentista, of course, is so moving and I just loved it. So anyway, you can go back to your question.
Well, thank you so much. It's so interesting that we have that in common where we both started out kind of writing in a little bit of a different genre and then shifted to, and I want to talk about that because a lot of writers aren't able to do that. They kind of get pinned into one genre. And when a book does well, the publisher or maybe the editor is like, we want more of that. And so we're both really fortunate that we are able to write in different genres and explore different kinds of characters, both culturally, but also like their backgrounds, but also their interests. And like both of us actually have a little bit of humor. I would say, my second book went a little dark, but within Hana Hsu, there's a lot of humor. It's really funny. It kind of runs under the surface. It's like, you have to be watching carefully, but I had a lot of moments where I'm like, kind of snickering. But so you started out as an environmental attorney, which I think is interesting because you do have a science background. I have a science background in healthcare, but to be an environmental attorney, you have to understand science and understand, the things that are going on within your, your fiction world, but there has to be a basis in that. So tell me a little bit, like, are you still practicing? Or are you shifting to writing full time?
Yeah, so I no longer practice. It was my first career, and I was an environmental attorney for a little over 10 years. And so I was very much like a typical child of immigrants, where like it wasn't so much my parents, like forcing me into a traditional, like successful career, but I was sort of had internalized that myself. So even though growing up, I always was very creative, I loved to do art and writing. When I went to college, I really enjoyed taking art classes, but I felt like I had to do a practical, like major and a practical career. And luckily, I was very interested in environmental issues. And so, I had just as much passion for that. And so I decided, well, I want to go into environmental law and make some positive change. And so I actually, did that for a good 10 years, mostly in DC. And then, but then when my kids were young and I wanted to scale back and spend time with them, that was a time I also was like, maybe I can like use all this free time I'm going to have, with little toddlers in the house to work on my art and writing. Of course, I had no free time to speak of, but I did like get myself sort of back into and interested in, the whole field of children's writing and illustration.
Well, and it's so, we have such, because mine was the same thing. I went to school and became an optometrist. Then when the kids were little, started writing, waiting for them outside karate, waiting outside dance. And so kind of occupying my time with my first love.
But do you still practice though, right? I mean, that's
a tiny bit. I'm having a hard time letting go. I love my patients. They're like family. I've been doing it 27 years. So it's going to be really hard for me to let go. So I need to, I don't have a lot of time, but yeah, I think I am going to be transitioning to full-time writing soon as well. So
yeah, when I found that one of the things I missed wasn't so much like the substance of what I was doing, but more like the professional identity,
right?
Of being an attorney or, having colleagues and going to the office.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, it's for sure. I love the people and watching, my patients, their babies, and now they're having babies. It's very odd. And you go, wow, I am getting old. So getting back to your book. So you shifted from a contemporary work to science fiction. And I want to get more into how that happened. But I think that if you could give us a little bit of maybe just a quick synopsis of your book, just a few moments, and then just maybe do a reading for us so we can hear a little bit of this book before we all go out and buy it.
Okay, yeah, sure. Well, here's the book, Hana Hsu and the Ghost Crab Nation. And basically it's set 30 years in the future. And the premise is that all of society is super interconnected and online. And the way they do that is when kids turn 13, they get their brains meshed into the multiweb. So basically, essentially connected to the internet. Hana Hsu is the protagonist. She's a 12-year-old. She actually loves to work with her hands, and she's a bit of an old soul. She tinkers, but she's very excited to get meshed herself because she feels like this will get her closer to her high-powered scientist mother and her high-achieving older sister. So she's all excited, but as she embarks on this journey to, get ready to get meshed, she learns that not everything is what it seems. And the corporations that control this technology, have more nefarious and, intent. And basically, she meets some cool friends and interesting allies, like a junkyard scavenger and a Qigong master. And so all of these things come together as she embarks on this adventure, figuring out this conspiracy. So,
okay, and I was mispronouncing it. It's Shu, not Sue, because I know a lot of HSU and they pronounce it Sue.
Yeah. So
okay, so it's Shu. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So I'm going to just start with the first pages, and I think I'll just read for a few minutes, maybe 3, 4, or 5 minutes, to give you a flavor of the story. So, chapter 1. It starts with a little quote that says, "One day I will fly with my birds, HH, June 6, 2053. And then the story starts. Hana was late and nowhere she was supposed to be. She hurried through the junkyard, sidestepping the pits and sharp edges of scrap plastic and tire rims. She wrinkled her nose at the sour rot and waved away the cyberflies. Her eyes darted back and forth, scanning past the scavenger kids picking through the trash on the lookout for her own prize. She was here for a reason. She had to find the perfect piece for the pigeon automaton she was making for Lynn. A few hours from now, her older sister would get meshed at the Enmesh Day ceremony. Like all 13-year-olds, Lynn would join the world of adults. Her neural implants would activate, and her brain would be connected to the multiweb online at all times. The moment that happened, everything would change. Hana would be left behind. Until it was her turn to be meshed a year from now, Hana wouldn't be able to compete with Lynn's mesh friends, and she just knew Lynn would forget about her. She already kind of had. The last time Hana and Lynn had made bird bots together was when Ba was alive. They both used to tuck notes with their wishes inside, the metal bellies and clever trapdoors. But now only Hana sent the bots to the wind, rattling off to who knew where. Lynn too busy to bother with such childish things. It was Ba who'd always insisted on adding a pièce de résistance, the finishing touch that showed a bot was made with love. That was what she was looking for, a special piece for Lynn's present. Finishing the bot for Lynn was the best chance to reach her sister and hold on to what they had together. At the top of a trash pile, Hana wiped her brow. The Atlantic breeze brought a welcome scent of salty air. A car buzzed overhead, flying towards city center in the distance. Hana's heart made like a hummingbird at the sight of the gleaming buildings and hover cars swarming like glittering insects. In a few hours, she'd be there. In the thick of this excitement, watching her sister get meshed and enjoying her own startup festivities. Her comm vibrated and rang. Ah, yeah, it was Ma's ringtone, a techno oldie from the 2020s. She didn't need to hear Ma say, Hana Hsu, get right home this instant, so she wiped it off. Since Ba died a year ago, Ma had thrown herself into her genetic research, a rocket shooting to the stars while burning Hana into cinders in her wake. And now Ma expected her to jump at her call? No thanks. Besides, she'd be home soon, so there was nothing for Ma to worry about. A glint in the trash caught her eye. Hana scrambled down to it. Peeking from the rubble was a small round item with gears and hands, an antique watch like the ones Ba used to collect. It was perfect, as if Ba had reached across from the other side to give her a gift on this special day. Hana reached for the treasure. A hand darted across her view and snatched it away. Hey, she looked up, and her stomach clenched. The girl towering over her was solidly built, with spiky, almost white hair, and ice blue eyes. She wore a grimy tank top, cargo pants, and scuffed up boots. An octopus tattoo crawled up her left arm, and a crab was inked on her right wrist. The scavenger kids at the junkyard had never bothered Hana before, treating her like an eccentric visitor. Why, of all days, did she have to be picked on today? Hana decided she couldn't show any fear. I saw it first. Too bad, because I got it first. The girl dangled the watch from its cracked band and inspected it with a smug smile. She looked a few years older than Hana, maybe 15 or so. So that's the beginning of the story. And this was pretty much the setting of that scene.
I loved when I saw that picture. I'm like, I know where Hana is right there, and I know what she's doing. I love that. And I love that you started with something that, any child reading the book or any person reading the book will see this little, busted up watch. And we're like, oh, it's just a watch, but it has such value. You've given it this she has a yearning to find these things to give her sister something special. So you took something, this everyday item, and made it like really valuable. And so right away in the opening scene, she's just dying to get that little watch. And if you keep reading, you're like, oh my gosh, she's just got to get the watch. It has just a little busted up watch, but it means so much. So you started out with one of my first question was, so this hobby she has of creating automatons with her grandmother, and it used to be her grandfather, who we know now has passed away, or is gone. And so her sister at one point, they kind of shared the hobby as well. And it just is such this familial bonding with this very everyday activity. So they're living in this really modern world, but they have something very tangible to bond over. And a lot of us had that with our grandparents or parents. With myself, with my grandmother, it was for sure gardening and chickens and things like that. Did you have anything like that with a parent or grandparent, that something that was just very, I don't want to say like something slow, but something everyday life that just, you bonded over?
Yeah, so definitely with my grandparents, I didn't really know because one passed away well, it's a complicated story, but basically I only met three of my grandparents like a few times in my life. So, but that kind of bonding event definitely with my mom, because my mom just cannot keep her hands still. So whether she's like, watching TV or whatever, she's always doing something. So she's, picking the ends off green beans, or, she sewed a lot. And so she taught me how to sew. And so I used to make clothes for my dolls while she made clothes for us. And we'd all have matching clothes of the same, like material. So yeah, those kinds of things, like it was very like material, as you say.
And then those things become really precious, like something that you made with your hands. And yeah, I love that you brought that in, because the world is very modern. And so one thing, we go from her ordinary world of showing us this hobby, and she really just wants to connect with her family. And we learn that pretty quickly, because they have, in this society, people become meshed. And during this process, like, what a creepy concept, first of all. But the irony is that it's not so far-fetched, like, when you explain some of these things. So I want to go a little bit more into this, but Hana yearns for something that we all do as humans, which is to connect with others. And for her, it's to connect with her family. But in her case, it comes with a price. So she's feeling disconnected. We find out really quickly, because her sister's getting meshed, her mother's already meshed, and they're very busy and they're connected to everything else but the everyday events. Can you speak a little bit to, was there something, because always story ideas come from somewhere. So can you speak to where this came from and maybe how that idea came to you?
Yeah, it's sort of hard to like exactly pinpoint, how this idea came. I mean, there's the general, sort of idea, just as a parent, always like watching your own children be online so much. And myself, I could see myself being, totally addicted. But I think the germ of the idea, not so much the premise of people being online all the time, but the idea behind like, what does it mean, right? If you are constantly bombarded with information, and what does it mean when corporations have your information for, either marketing to you or influencing you politically? Because when I wrote this book, it was in 2017, 2018. And it was at that point, the news had come out about Cambridge Analytica, how they used a lot of information gathered from, Facebook and, our consumer habits. And they basically really influenced a lot of people in major ways, like with Brexit and with the election. And so that sort of prompted me to be, I don't know how that translated into this specific middle grade, like idea, except that I was like, wow, what if, kids were, the whole society was so integrally connected that you were online all the time. And what does that mean for, people? And in a lot of ways, except for the like physical kind of meshware that I envisioned, in a lot of ways, I feel like we are sort of at that level, right?
Right. I have a critique partner who's younger, quite a bit younger, and he doesn't mind. Like, there are things that I'm like, oh my gosh, you're just giving away your privacy. And he's like, they can find it out anyway. Like, it doesn't faze him at all to let people know those things. And I don't know if that's a generational thing or not, but I think we should discuss, like, for me, I call it the creep factor. Like, that's creepy to me, that someone can be watching or listening to me at any
Well,
time. That's
it's so
huge
interesting
invasion of
because
privacy.
you know how they talk about how your phones aren't listening to you. And I always thought, well, I'm not quite sure it really is the case, except just 2 days ago, this specific incident happened where my husband and I were walking on the beach and I was carrying my phone, and we were noticing, nowadays a lot of these new sunshades are these it's like a wire with a big like billowy, tent. So it wasn't like a traditional umbrella. So my husband and I were talking and we're saying, oh, we should really get one of these because these are cool. They look lightweight. So we just had a whole conversation about it. And then not a day later on Facebook, I get an ad for that specific thing we were talking about, even though I have not even begun Googling, because I wanted to buy it, but I hadn't even started researching it. So it was really wild.
Yeah, it's just not true. They can listen. they are listening, and they can. It's one like couple of keywords, and they put it together, and you're marketed to. But even here, Hannah's mother or grandmother is really resistant to this, and this is without going into too many things, so I don't want to give your story away, but she speaks a lot to I could be the grandmother and going, I'm not doing that. Are you kidding? But this is like something that I think if we were to present now, there would probably be a huge percentage of people who would say, sure, if I can have the benefit of being meshed and maybe these other benefits, why would I not do that? And so did you do that on purpose? Like you made it kind of enticing, like, someone go, oh my gosh, that is tempting. There are aspects of being meshed that a lot of people would want to do.
I didn't want to write the story in such a black and white moralizing way. I didn't want it to be like, oh no, you shouldn't be online, because I myself get the allure of it,
Right.
So I totally made the virtual world that they go into super fun and exciting, and the fact that they're able to access all this information, it is, it's really changed all of our lives. And I myself, rely on being, connected all the time. So yeah.
Well, it was really evident that you kind of posed this, I don't want to say moral and ethical quandary, but it was kind of like there was no wasn't really a right or wrong. It was more like, what would you do? And I think that's a great thing about, especially writing for middle grade, is posing it as a question. Like none of what you wrote was preachy or didactic. It was very much, what would you do? Like, if, and so I loved that aspect of the book. And I know kids will as well.
And I also I actually do want to also say that, like, as I was researching for the book, there were scientists who actually did insert wire mesh into mice's brains, and they connected them together and to the internet. So they did it through wires, but I just took that technology and took out the wires and made it wireless. Yeah. And then, there's a certain billionaire who's also thinking about doing this. So, it's not. Well,
you wrote it first because there are parts in your book where actually they talk about animals and how this all started. And so, you get credit for inventing it. But, it's when you're writing science fiction like this, we could go, oh, well, that's so far-fetched or whatever. But you start with a kernel of truth, which you did. And gosh, who was I listening to? I went to a lecture one time, and it was a sci-fi writer, and they were talking about how if you start with a kernel of truth, the reader will follow you wherever you go. And you did that, where you started with like, this really can happen, and this does happen, and then you take us on this amazing adventure because there is a lot of like STEM. Like this book could totally be, you have genetics, and all of it's accurate. It's all, well thought out. So you obviously did your research. But when I
wanted to also say that you did much the same in the Last Cuentista also, because I feel like you took, technology and ideas of, that are around about, like generation ships and, going out and exploring. And then you added the heart and the story, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, you start with a tiny bit of truth and then you just go crazy. Go make it totally unbelievable. Go, what? Well, I started with a little bit of truth. So you should believe this. So when you were writing this though, were there points where you were like, okay, this is a huge suspension of, are people going to believe this? Or were you really in that world and feeling it?
Yeah, I guess I was definitely, I guess the thing is, because I am not actually a scientist or trained scientist, my sister is. So a lot of the scientific research, I relied on her, especially the genetics. So I did take artistic license in the jumps of taking this animal research and then extrapolating and saying, well, now humans are going to be X. And I don't want to reveal the sort of what was going on, but I did. So I felt like maybe the actual conspiracy and nefarious plot may be not so, grounded in actual science.
Well, and I love as well, because, obviously we're writing fiction, and I love how you made the future world. It was just kind of very seamlessly woven in. It was Chinese culture. And so there were some language aspects, and it was, and I love that it wasn't explained. It was just kind of written in and accepted as the reader. And for myself, I don't think I even realized until I was done how much you did that. And so I really appreciated that, because I think that a child reading this who might be unfamiliar with some of those things, by the end of the book, they're familiar, and they don't feel again like they have been taught a lesson. It's just woven in, and that obviously you can tell that it came naturally to you as you were writing it. So I think that's really important. So a child who's reading this who might be unfamiliar with some of the words or some of the things, they're going to feel right at home. And in this novel that incorporates that.
Yeah, I do think you also do that as well. Just, kind of bringing in the cultural influences, but in a very subtle way, and also just like flavoring the story and making centering those cultural influences, because you're not explaining them, right? So
exactly. And I think we both as well, because we have different cultures that come to, both of us are influenced by different cultures. I was teasing you because I grew up in California, and I said, you're more Latina than I am because of where you grew up. And so I think that that's important, because both of our books are very, and they're not the same. The characters, they're not just one character that's a cookie cutter. Every time it's the same character. They have lots of different influences, and Hannah does as well. And I love that you wove that in, and her friends also, Tomas, and oh my gosh, well, ink is interesting. Well, I don't want to get too much in, because people want to read it. I'm not going to talk about ink, because that'll give too many spoilers.
Yeah. And speaking of the cultural aspects, I just wanted to point out there was one very cool thing really close to the beginning of your story where I don't know, was it the grandmother or the character was telling a story, but then you ended it with the phrase, colorín colorado, este cuento se ha acabado, right? Mm-hmm. And it's just such a fun thing that just brings, memories for people for whom, that was part of their growing up. But if it wasn't, you just feel oh, that's a really cool way to end a story, So
yeah, it's funny, because I think that, yeah, if you haven't grown, I mean, we do grow up with it. We're once upon a time or whatever, but there's also an ending. But there's the sayings are sometimes a little nonsensical, but that there's a story that is about to begin and end. And so, yeah. And I think that, I mean, there were so many aspects of that with your book too. I was laughing when you were talking in the book, there's, you talk about fighting over the check at, I don't know if you said dim sum, but that's what I know, like over dinner, whatever. But my kids always thought it was so funny because they would go, my kids are also Chinese. They would go to dinner with their, or dim sum with their grandparents, and people would fight over the check. And it's like, it's this battle royale to who's going to pay the bill. And my kids were always like, oh my gosh, someone's going to get hurt. Is there battling? And you use that. And so I'm reading this in your book and I just was dying laughing. I'm like, okay, that's a real thing. And like my kids say, aya. I didn't grow up saying aya, but it's a very much, it's like, oh my gosh, like, so when I'm reading it, I just was like, oh, it sounds like one of my kids. So I just think that, there are a lot of kids who will appreciate that, who don't get to see themselves in novels. So yeah, well done.
Yeah. And actually, just as a way of explanation for those people who haven't read the book, in my future world, it's set in the United States. It's 30 years in the future, but it's heavily Chinese influence. So people, even non-Chinese people, are eating, Chinese porridge or shifan, or, using Chinese slang words. And the reason for that in my world building was because the main mesh technology, it was very influenced by one of the Chinese companies. And so, once people are mesh, they're very, in my world, very influenced by all sorts of cultures.
Yeah, there's like battling companies, and I Ching is the company that's like the and you never really know, like, yeah, they're bad guys, but then you're like wondering, like, what are their intentions? You never, so I love that. But I don't want to give too much away, but, so I love to, because I was watching Stranger Things last night and I was thinking of your book and how you wove in the inclusion of, in like, kind of like the 80s and 90s mall. And like, that's where people go to like get away and disconnect from all of this. And I didn't tell you this before, but you had Contempo Casuals in your mall. I worked there. We were talking about this with my family the other night, and they took me off the sales floor because I was a horrible salesperson. I was only allowed to sell accessories and check people out.
Oh, that's too funny.
But I was like, oh my gosh, I haven't heard Contempo Casuals in how many decades? And like, you had Walden books. So it was a shout out to Walden. I used to love going to the mall, but I think that a lot of parents who will read this with their kids are going to love that. And the other mentioned, there were other stores as well, but I think
that was actually one of the reasons awesome. I picked 30 years in the future instead of something like 100 years in the future. I wanted it so that there could be still people, like that, like the adults of today could, would be the grandparents of, my world. And therefore,
right.
The nostalgia of the grandparents are of the 70s and 80s. So
well, yeah, no kidding. So, I mean, yeah, I was thinking about that, and for sure I could be Popo, which is the grandma. I think I am.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I'm going to, I think it's pronounced Qigong, right?
Qigong, actually.
Qigong.
Yeah.
And I know a little bit about this because I watch a lot of History Channel, but it's about energy and life force, and it's an ancient art in China, and going back to the 2nd century BC. I did look that part up, and it's regulated by the Chinese government. And so I was wondering if you chose that on purpose, because I know that when my older daughter is from China, and when we went there would be people practicing in the park, but it's regulated by the government. You can't just go do it on your own. And I was wondering, because there is that factor in your book, because everybody's meshed and there's a little bit of that control factor, if you chose that reference on purpose because of that.
Well, it's interesting because you just taught me something new. I did not know that Qigong is regulated by the Chinese government. My father practices Qigong, and so I just know it from, my personal experience with it. And it is a meditative practice dealing with breathing and moving qi, which is the energy in your body. But what's really interesting is there's a different part of the book. It's a tiny bit of a spoiler, but there's a sort of like a more advanced level of Qigong called Dian Shui, which is like a special, almost like a martial art. And that is something that my grandmother was actually, I don't think she actually learned it, but it was like offered to her to teach, to learn when she was young. And it was And it was sort of like a secret kind of qigong that was only passed on within family members. And so that was something that, I included a little bit of that into the story towards the end. So
I loved that aspect. My kid's great grandfather came to the US when he was 17, and he was immediately drafted and was put on a ship in World War II, didn't speak English. But when he was done, he moved to Fresno, California, of all places. And there he taught at, it was like a Chinese YMCA, basically, sort of center. And he taught this, to people who were from China in Fresno, but it had been restricted before that because there was kind of like the revolution was going on. And so people were unable to do, any religious practice, and they considered this almost like a religion. So anyway, it was one of those things that I love that you incorporated that. I love that Grandma watches telenovelas. And if somebody doesn't know what telenovelas are, kind of like Mexican soap operas. So I'm like, oh my gosh, you have this world where you took also kind of like the best things of maybe what you grew up with and what I grew up with, and it's in this novel as well. And I love that you have this cross-cultural reference.
So I definitely they're Mexican telenovelas, but they're also like Venezuelan telenovelas, and so those were the ones that I was thinking Popo was watching.
Well, did you watch telenovelas?
I did. I watched them, and there was one star from Venezuela who was so popular. His name was Guillermo Dávila, and his mother actually lived in my apartment building, so occasionally he'd come and visit, and we were all so starstruck if we ran into him, So,
well, I'm going to scoot along because I want to allow some time for questions. So I have a couple more things, but I want to make sure if anybody out there, and I see there are many of you, pop over to the I do see. Wait, Q&A. Let's see. Oh, we do have some questions. So let me move this over. Let me make sure. Oh, I want to say one last thing before we go to that. So you don't shy away from controversy in this. And I love that. I loved the crowdsource news network that would pop up at the beginning of some of the chapters. And it's a really clever way of showing the world's top stories, but also in your fiction world. But they all sound really realistic, but also very dangerous. So the one that I thought was, oh my gosh, but it actually is happening. And it almost in your book, I'm like, people might read it, go, this doesn't sound real, but was the Chimera story where they're kind of playing God with human and animal cells. But also I love the story about the human and robot hybrids. And again, I don't want to say what it is because I want people to read that moment and go, oh my gosh, but that really could happen. Do you want to speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I mean, that was just when I first wrote the book in its original drafts, I did write long news articles. So it was like a page long, and it really helped me build the world. But then people who read it were like, oh, this really kind of takes you out of the story. And then I forget who was it, maybe one of my editors who suggested, well, why don't we just make them really short? And when it became short, then that was probably like their attention span anyway in the future. And then I can just get the gist of it. And like, for example, I just do like news stories about the environment or science. And one news story I have in the book, I guess I'll spoil it because it's very little, is about how 15 years ago from the story, the Ross ice shelf, like melted, and there's lots of environmental consequences to that. But unfortunately, like now I'm reading, that's actually happening. The Ross shelf is melting, and it's not, 10 years, 15 years from now, it's happening now. So it's actually kind of scary.
Well, okay. You know what? I just realized too, oh my gosh, now I'm like, did I dream this? But I think it really happened where there is an AI who actually thinks it's human. So when we're talking about human and robot hybrids, this is really happening. See, you're a psychic. I don't know.
Well, I have to say I'm not the originator of many of these ideas, because these ideas have been in science fiction, for many, many years.
This is true, but like the way you implement it, the timing is amazing. So that, I mean, probably luck, but good job.
Yeah, thank you.
So I'm going to hop over to some questions. So the first question is, how much harder was it for you to develop your second or subsequent books?
Yeah, so this sci-fi book, even though it was published after my first contemporary book, is actually my first book, that I queried and everything. So, and my Manchi book was slightly different. I'd say like the book that I'm writing now is like another genre. And I don't know, every time I write a book, I feel like I'm starting from scratch and I don't know how to write. So every book is different. So it is hard to, I don't know, is that the case with you? Do you find that you have more tools, or?
Yeah. I started writing the Last Cuentista. It was a short story years ago, and it just kind of haunted me, and I came back to it, and I jump all over the place. In my story ideas, but my idea, there's no pattern to my ideas. I go all over the place. So writing like subsequent books, I always worry because I go, oh, no editor is going to want to, because it's so different from what I've written before. But so far, I just knocked on probably particle board, not wood.
So I'm curious, how did you go from like a very funny contemporary to this darker sci-fi?
Well, I don't know. I think it was my mood. I think that, when the world changes and what's going on in my life, my brain goes somewhere else, and I just have to write with what I'm feeling. And I never know. And I think a lot of writers feel this way when we finish a book and then we go back and read it, we see what we were going through at that time. And a lot of times it's really, you go, oh, wow, you can reflect and go, that was very telling that I wrote about this or this person, and that was going on. So you can't help but do that.
Yeah. And a lot of times if you see a food scene, it means I was hungry at that moment. So.
Very true. Okay. So from Ryan, given this is your first book in the sci-fi genre and outside contemporary, what drew you into the genre? And are there other genres you want to write about in the future?
Yeah, so sci-fi is like probably my original love. Like I grew up and I read a ton of both fantasy and sci-fi. Those were my two that I just, loved, all the Isaac Asimov, really old stuff like that. Ray Bradbury, and then all the Hobbit, Tolkien, all the fantasy books. So I am interested also in writing fantasy. So those are probably the two genres I most enjoy writing, but I also like contemporary. So I guess I like them all.
Me too. I hope I live a long time, because I want to write some fantasy too. And I love Ursula Le Guin, and there's just so many, I don't think I'm going to be able to stick in one.
And then particularly for this, I really enjoy cyberpunk in adult fiction, but cyberpunk in adult fiction, aside from all the like high tech themes, tends to be kind of seedy, and a lot of criminal elements. So I kind of brought that into the middle grade world by mostly just dealing with the ideas and not so much the seediness of it.
Yeah, not so much the seedy, but it was gritty. Like your world was gritty, and it was like seeing, some of the homes and the way they lived. We can, by intuition, we can go, okay, well, this is kind of what this world is like. And so even though you don't come right out and say it, there are rough aspects of, how some have to live, the have and have nots. So, were there any sci-fi media, books, TV shows, video games that influenced either the world building, characters, or any aspect of writing this book?
I mean, I guess it must basically everything I enjoy watching, a lot of, as I sort of the same answer almost, like, some of my favorite movies and TV shows are like Blade Runner and Altered Carbon, those like really cyberpunky stories that I basically turned into middle grade.
I love this next question. if Petra and Lupe met Hannah and Becca, what's one thing they would bring if they had a hangout either online or in person?
That's interesting. Do you want to start with yours?
What's one thing they would bring if they, well, it's so, because this is a great question, because getting back to it, that even though we both wrote each of these characters, they would bring totally different things. So, you know, for myself, like Petra and Lupe would probably, you know, bring stuff to play baseball. Like, you know, she would want to, you know, play catch, and Petra would probably bring a book. And, you know,
yeah, it's funny for me. Becca would probably bring like her phone to record, and you know, she's like a little reporter, and but Hannah, meanwhile, would probably bring one of her bird bots, you know, to.
I was gonna say, yeah, Hannah would bring a bot, but I would see, like when we, like, I could see, I would like, from what I think Hannah and Petra would probably be the two that would get along the best. Let's see. Given you both have published 2 books in the middle grade demographic, what have you learned over the course of your author career? What tips have kept you going, and what reflections do you have on what makes middle grade a compelling place to write in and also read?
I'm sure you have thoughts about that.
I do. This one's, I've thought a lot about it. It's easy for me. I think that writing middle grade, it's where I was most awkward and where I had the most emotions and the most vivid memories of my childhood. And so I always go back to that time. And there are sometimes I'm writing something, I'm like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe I'm putting this on paper, because it's very personal. But it ends up being the best stuff, you know, the stuff that just feels like, oh my gosh, there's emotional turmoil as you're putting it on the paper. But I think, you know, what I've learned a lot recently, and mostly it's that I have to learn to take time for myself. Your energy can get drained really quickly, and through the world, you know, what's going on around us. And I have to learn to turn stuff off, turn off social media, and just like take a breath, because writing is not always easy, and you want to be able to focus on, you know, your characters. So that's probably my advice to writers. But as far as the other part, I think I belong in middle grade. I do like writing picture books, but middle grade is my sweet spot.
Yeah, I feel like similarly, middle grade really appeals to me, because I remember that's like the time of my life when I just lived in books, you know, and I would fall in love and just be completely immersed. Like during high school and college was actually a time I hardly read outside of for school, you know. And so I think as an author, I really want to connect with those, you know, kids who are just falling in love with reading and falling in love with the whole idea. And I do think, like you, that's a time when I can really access easily. I remember those, you know, feelings and moments. And I was a shy kid, so I can write the shy characters better than the others. And then as far as advice for other authors, I've really found that it's so important to like build a community of fellow writers. It doesn't have to be large, but people who you can really just, you know, vent with or commiserate, and then also find some good critique partners, you know, because at least for me, I really improve when I get feedback. So
right. Same. Sometimes it's hard to hear. You got to have a tough shell, but yeah, it's important. What are you both working on now? Oh, I just got what's called an edit letter. So I'm still, I'm working on, I don't know how much I can say. It may or may not be in the same universe as Petra, and it's become a really complicated book. And so I'm working on that, and I'm writing a graphic novel as well. So I've got a couple of projects going, a middle grade graphic novel. I'm not an illustrator, but sometimes my brain sees things like movies and pictures. So I think it's a good idea, but it might be a bomb. We'll see.
Well,
But I'm working on a
exciting.
couple of things. But the one that I'm working on that has a lot of moving pieces that I'm like, oh my gosh, it's science fiction as well. And so
Oh, how fun.
it's fun, but oh boy, there's a lot of challenges.
Yeah, so the one I'm working on now is a middle grade fantasy that's based on a Chinese myth. So it's got the Chinese influences. And what's different about it is it's got multiple point of views, which is the first time I'm really trying to get a handle on it. I've written it before, but this is the time when I'm trying to make it work in a novel. So that's been interesting.
Oh, that sounds fun. I love folklore and mythology, so I am all over that. Sylvia, if you were going to have a Freaky Friday moment and switch lives with one of your characters for a day, who would you choose and why? I love that question.
I mean, I guess I would say, well, I guess the easy answer is sort of Hannah, because she's just like the main character who I've kind of fallen in love with. And, I actually am not like a tinkerer, so I would love to like be her and like go into a workshop and create something mechanical that works. I think
I would want to be Ink. She's so cool. I want to be a cool kid like Ink. She was awesome. Yeah, if you guys read about Ink, you'll understand. You'll want to be her too. Will either of you be at ALA later this week? Well, yeah, I will be.
Donna's going to be giving her speech.
They've been practicing. It's not going to go well. So inside scoop. I've been practicing, and I cry. I start crying, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is not going to go very well.
So even during your practice, you'll cry?
Yes, every time. It doesn't matter how many times I say it. So, and I have two speeches because I have to give the Pura Belpre speech earlier in the day, and then I do the Newbery later that afternoon. So I've learned some tricks to keep so I don't lose my voice, but I'm going to be able to do a lot. People are going to be so sick of hering me talk.
Well, I wish I were there. I'm not going to be there, but I wish I were there to hear you.
Me too. Is from Leslie, is this a standalone novel or part of a series?
Well, at the moment, it's a standalone novel. And if it does really well, the publisher might be interested in making it a series, but it's planned as a standalone. I do have a really great idea for the next book that I just wish I could write. So,
well, I'm going to go. Who is your publisher?
Razorbill.
I'm going to go write them a letter after this, because it ended with such like, it's open and like, yes, everything was very well tied up, but there's so much more you could do in this world. And so, yeah. I'll go write him a letter right after this. Are you interested in writing adult fiction? This is from Nancy. Nonfiction, or is there something about youth readers that draws your attention and interest? What other genres appeal to you as an author?
Yeah, well, I have written like adult, like creative nonfiction and short stories. And so that really does appeal to me. For now, though, because like I kind of still feel like I have more middle grade stories to write, that's kind of what I'm focusing on. So,
well, I'm so proud of us because we are about on time. We've got a couple more questions. So I feel like it's, again, probably luck, but we did a good job. Sylvia, someone another question.
Well, maybe we should give, Heidi a chance to wrap up soon. So
what was the most challenging thing about world building? What was your process for developing the futuristic aspects of your world? This is from Lisa.
I guess the most challenging aspect was maybe like making sure the science was plausible, because that is my weak point. But basically, I wrote the story first and then like threw in, like what I needed for the story. And then I had to figure out, well, could it work, And so I kind of knew what I wanted to happen. And so I had to build the world out. But adding all the like details of the world was just super fun. That was just kind of like my imagination figuring out like, what did the junkyard look like? What did, things like that.
Well, and I think like in your world as well, like my background is in biology and chemistry, but this is different. This is like physics and electronics, and there are things that I don't understand. So I believed all of what you said. Given you've mentioned the cyberpunk genre and how you brought it into the middle grade genre with your own rendition, given the grittiness of the genre in both YA and adult, was there any difficulty in making the tone friendly to a middle grade audience without going overboard on the more grim elements of the genre? And what's something that impresses you about cyberpunk genre compared to other sci-fi genres? That's interesting because we kind of were talking, that's from Ryan again. We talked a little bit about that. And yeah, it is a thing that you have to watch for with middle grade. There are things you,
right.
I don't want to say can and can't, but
even though I was like very inspired by cyberpunk, I actually did like try to make things feel like grounded. And even like the virtual game world, I set in a fantasy space really, because it's ancient Chinese, like warriors and monks. So it's a totally different vibe. And then when it was in her workshop, I sort of thought more of like almost a steampunk vibe. So, I really like mixed a lot of the genres, but the parts about cyberpunk that really interest me are the ideas of it. Because one of the main ideas is like, if you're in a really high tech world and you're enhancing humans with like technology, what does that make humans? Does it change who we are as people? And that's sort of in the story, that kind of theme is what I wove in.
It's a deep theme, and it's something I explore too, is like, what does it really mean to be human? And what defines us?
Your whole story about like, what was it that like was the soul of humanity, right? Is kind of,
two very different stories, but kind of exploring the same thing about, what we are as human and what makes us human. And is there a genre or style of book you'd love to write, but are scared to try and write? Oh, what a good question.
Yeah. Well, I think that would be, I want to write a graphic novel one day. So maybe I'll have to call upon you for tips.
Yeah, I haven't figured it out yet. I actually I joined a graphic novel critique book or group, and I am learning so much, and it is not the same. It's just not even remotely the same. And that's a great question, because I really was afraid to, and I wrote a book that was a picture book, and we tried submitting it, and the feedback was this should be a graphic novel. And so that's why I'm trying, and I'm learning. It's going to take me a while, but anyway, yeah, it is a thing where you want to try to write something, but it can be a little scary. And you had the perfect answer. If you surround yourself with other people, the writing community is one that really supports one another, and we really care about one another. We want to see each other succeed. So call on your friends when you're scared or nervous to write something. So
awesome.
Anyway,
I'm glad we went through all those questions.
I know, what a wonderful conversation. This was wonderful. And even there were things I learned about your book I didn't know. So thank you so much for letting me be here.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks so much to both of you, Sylvia and Donna. This was such a wonderful conversation, and thank you for sharing your personal stories and just talking about these cross-cultural connections that you both have. Just really made it so rich for us to listen into. So thank you so much for that. And for anybody who hasn't read the book yet, if you are not convinced to read this book now, I don't know how else you could get more excited. It was so great. I mean, both of you are such, the way you described the book and just all the different scenes and the connections, it was really wonderful. So thank you so much for that. And as we mentioned, there is still this wonderful swag to get up with the book. So these really fun stickers, the automaton bird and the wonderful illustrations, and we have these great book plates. So please jump on and buy the book for yourself and a friend, and you're going to love it. So it's a great summer read. It's a really fun adventure. So thank you for that. And thank you for both being here. I know you're both very busy, and I know, Donna, you're getting ready for ALA. So we thank you for, coming and spending your time with us. And Sylvia, thank you for spending your book birthday with us. So that was really special. So
yeah, thank you so much. This has been really fun.
we really appreciate it. So